what I'm thinking of is actually bringing that in, so that. But then I realized, well, you've probably got to have the little pads to clean it off each time it moves from one person to another.
Well, I mean, you can always just like do the search Google Street View, and then you can still like maneuver it on the computer. So not as cool, but possible.
Well, yeah, it has the search. It has all the search engines that Google Earth has. The main difference is that instead of just seeing it on a flat screen, you're surrounded by what you're viewing, and the pictures of the rooms. You're so like the one guy that I was kind of following. There's no way that you know for sure that that's what you're doing, but it's just often the pictures that I would end up looking at were the same. It's the same kind of camera that I have, where you're holding it and it's taking the whole picture. So of course you're always in it with a huge hand, which is that's another issue to solve, I suppose.
Happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween.
I was wondering why there were so many people in costumes downstairs. Like, what the heck's going on? Oh yeah, it's the 30th. Okay. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense.
I'm pretending to be a professor.
I'm pretending to be a college student.
I'm clinical depression. That's fantastic. I accept that.
You know what rose
So
us together? It's the hoodie.
Thank
So-
you, right?
Is that Little Red Riding Hood,
Yes.
or is it? Oh,
She is.
So who's the wolf?
Nobody. Okay, well,
That's only half the cost
so
too.
hold on. If I would have had time to actually go over, because I do special effects makeup, I could have made her like the wolf coming out of her. But I'm lazy and didn't have time because I just did.
Wait, why would the wolf come out of her?
That'd be cool.
Where
Because
did she come out of
Little
the
Red
wolf?
Riding Hood is the wolf. It's the whole transformation theory.
Have you not seen that movie? The newest one with Amanda Seyfried in it?
I haven't seen the newest one.
Anyway,
Her
but
dad is the wolf.
Okay.
yes, and so that's very good.
And it's like genes crossed down. And she's the only one who can understand her dad.
Well, I mean, the original Grimm story is not very nice either, so.
No, it's not
It's not.
at all.
because now when you see the costume of the red cloak, if you have the white hat, then it's the Handmaid's Tale. Totally different.
The Grimm stories are always the best ones that I know.
Oh yeah, definitely.
And they always cut it out because it doesn't family friendly.
And there's like,
It doesn't suck.
It's like-
It does though.
It really does.
I mean, we only have we had the Disney movie versions of them, but then that's still only like 10 Grimm stories. There's like
Yeah.
600 some of them. I mean,
Yeah.
there's a huge collection.
And they actually just found more.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they
Oh.
found more like 2 or 3 years ago,
Nice.
and that's really cool.
So yeah, if Disney could get its act together, we'd have even more
Yeah, right.
movies. Probably.
This is also the end of October. It's November already. Next class. So, Epicurus. So first article. Descartes, mind and body. And then the link that I give is to Chalmers. And Chalmers in this particular video is talking about virtual reality and the nature of consciousness associated with virtual reality, which, by the way, was why I was using virtual reality last night to tour Paris. Contemplating, what sort of consciousness is this? Well, to start off with Epicurus, I usually show a video. Morgan, I'm sure you've already seen it, right? That's
Like, there's a couple interesting
what's
theories.
the name of the party. Trimalchio's speech,
Yes.
right?
Mhm.
Right?
There's a couple of theories about virtual reality. One states that the only difference between virtual reality and reality is the level of detail, because you're conscious in both, so the only real difference is how you interact with it. And since virtual reality does not have quite the detailed nature does, and it doesn't have, like, for instance, you can't, like, feel it on your skin when you're touching something. That's one detail that they don't have yet. But as they keep developing it, eventually it'll be on par with reality. The only reason they can't do it now is because nature has so many details, they can't replicate it properly yet.
Can't smell and can't taste.
Yeah, so
It's just a visual
just visually.
and audio.
Until they actually, maybe in 600 years, who knows, but for now, it's just the level of
Actually,
detail.
the audio that we have is Google Earth has this absolutely elevator type music,
Yeah.
that they play while you're cruising around, the world. It changes, like if you're if you're like vertical, then you have a different kind of eerie kind of music. But then if you're down horizontal, then you're listening to like birds chirping and that kind of thing. So it's almost like, oh well, now you're on the Earth as opposed to being out in space. But say like last night I was cruising around Paris, and you don't hear any of the sounds of Paris. So even in like Versailles or the Louvre, you're looking. You could look at the art. You could see all the people standing around, and you think to yourself, "Boy, am I lucky that I'm not spending all my money to visit Paris and being in that crowd." Especially the Mona Lisa. When you just get into the room where the Mona Lisa is. I did take one of the 3 virtual tours of that with the guy that's on TV all the time. And I'm so glad, my goodness, it's so hot in there. He even complains about it. There's so many people, and the painting is like sitting at the far end of the room, so there's like this little postage stamp on the far wall, and you think, I've spent thousands of dollars to come here and be, standing up in a crowd of people that are all trying to see the same little postage stamp on the far wall. I think, no, not me. I'm cheating the whole business by getting the experience by just doing this. It is way cheaper, believe me. You might think buying those goggles is expensive, but compared to actually visiting Paris or Versailles or Belgium or wherever the heck you went, you're saving a fortune by not actually traveling anywhere. And I'm sure you're not getting as sick as often, because of course if you're traveling, you're getting the opportunity to imbibe other people's germs and rotten food, who knows what else. You get to find out why the French food is so horrible, all that kind of stuff. So I highly recommend, and I think what we're going to see is more and more people going that way. But this is a short scene from Fellini's Satyricon, which is a movie based on, the Satyricon is a poem by Petronius. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but a couple of boys basically traveling or walking around visiting Rome at the time of, not sure if it's Nero, but about that time, at the time of Nero. So it's pretty corrupt, and in this scene, they're inside the house of party all day, every day.
A questo vino bisogna che gli fate onore. I pesci devono nuotare. Grazie agli dei io non compro. Tutto quello che fa saliva mi viene da un mio podere che chissà dov'è. Dicono che sta tra Terracina e Taranto. Io me devo sconfinare con la Sicilia, perché mi voglio fare un viaggio fino in Africa. Così a piedi, a cavallo o anche per mare, navigo sempre sul mio. Simile in questo al sempre errante Ulisse. Le piace la citazione? Anche a tavola i classici ci stanno bene. Questa qui è la prima barba che mi tagliai. Io sembravo un genomo a 14 anni. E questi sono i lari miei, protettori della nostra proprietà. Affarone, contentone e guadambione, propizi siano gli dei. Che te curia sei?
Nella quarantesima.
Sei nato il caso o sei d'acquisto?
Né l'uno né l'altro, sono stato lasciato a te in testamento da Varza.
Cucina il più grosso, cucina, ma attento che se non vi è bene te passano la decuria di scopini.
Una volta un povero ricco vennero lì.
E che cos'è un povero?
Bravo, questa è buona.
Vado al vaso.
La giornata se ne va a morire. Mentre di volte hai visto la notte. Allora non c'è niente di meglio che passare dal letto alla tavola. Abbiamo avuto un gran freddo, il bagno mi ha scaldato a stento. Ah, è bene che mosche siamo, bene che mosche. Loro una certa resistenza ce l'hanno, ma noi niente più che delle bolle siamo.
Così come dice la contadina che aveva perduto la iene mezz'anno.
Nella sua mano il piombo diventava oro, era più nero che un corvo. C'aveva più di 70 anni e ancora andava in colore. Non lasciava in pace nemmeno il cane di casa.
Kind of the house of the dog, house of the dog of the dog of the house. In other words, theoretically, he would even screw his dog. Nobody was safe. One picture the guy posted from the Louvre was the jewelry from the
Ma come l'avete già cucinato?
Eugene.
E la pesce non l'avete nemmeno svettato. E me lo portate così? Il coco, chiamatemi! L'hai cotto intero, non l'hai aperto.
Pietà, mio signore,
Piegatelo e frustatelo.
ho sbagliato, ma abbi pietà.
Allora che aspetti, disgraziato? Svettalo qua, adesso.
Che meraviglia! I torti, gallini ingrassati, vendriglie d'uccelli, colori salsicce, palombe più moderne, chiocciole, rigo di cappucciata, prosciutto, panatella, rimaccione!
It's meant to be gross, I'm pretty sure. So, and that's actually one of the nicer parts of the movie. I think it came out in '68. No, it must have been later than that. Because two of my friends and I from the university went down to Philadelphia and watched it in a first-run theater on Chestnut Street in Philadelphia. Little theater, not much bigger than this room actually, and a little screen in front. Very weird. But Fellini wasn't really that popular. He His movies were very artsy and very strange. And it was gross. It was very, very gross. The grossest movies I've ever seen. But depicting a Rome that was gross. Very casual about killing people, all that kind of thing. And yet, that's considered Epicurean. But when you read Epicurus, you realize, wait a minute, the Romans completely took Epicurus differently than he obviously meant to be taken. So Epicurus is, as a philosopher, we call it even Epicurean, right? So we don't have another name for it, but we could also call it just happiness, I suppose. You know, like, you know, the whole goal of life is just to be happy. So hedonistic, I suppose. And you know, and a hedon, by the way, is like a particular measure of pleasure. So how many hedons of pleasure would I get from eating the pig instead of eating the sauerkraut? But maybe I would get more hedons of pleasure if I eat a little sauerkraut with the pig. You know, that kind of gives you some balance. So Epicurean restaurants are usually expensive and feed you weird things that you wouldn't find in like McDonald's or Denny's. Weird things. But Epicurus didn't recommend eating that kind of stuff. He thought being basically sane in your diet was the best thing. And he suggested restraint, not just so for him, when he's talking about being happy as the goal of life, he seems to be interested primarily in happiness in a calm, safe way, as opposed to going overboard. So, in this particular piece, he's talking about death. Don't worry about dying, because while you're alive, you're not dead. And once you're dead, you no longer are. So there's nothing to worry about. So the whole goal of life is just to enjoy life moment by moment. There's no afterlife or anything as far as he's concerned. Death, therefore, the most awful of evils, is nothing to us, seeing that when we are alive, death has not come, and when death has come, we are not alive. It is nothing, then, either to the living or to the dead, for with the living it is not, when the dead no longer exist. But in the world, at one time, people shun death as the greatest of all evils, and at another time choose it as a respite from the evils in life. The wise person does not appreciate life, nor does he fear the cessation of life. The thought of life is no offense to him, nor is the cessation of life regarded as an evil. And yet, an awful lot of people I've met have admitted that they've considered suicide at least one time or another. I even remember years ago driving home from work when I was an employee of Wawa Food Markets, like 7-Eleven. And it was just such a grind, and it seemed like life was going nowhere. I was, what, in my early 20s, I suppose. Driving home on a dark night, and you're going, what, 65 miles an hour in a car that you could clearly just like that, and you're done. So if you feel like life sucks, you know, that you could just end it so quick. You know, it's, as Wittgenstein says, it's a rushing of one's own defenses. If you're think of it, because your normal psychological concern would be to protect yourself for as long as possible. But at a moment, you know, where you're kind of weakened by being tired or angry, or I suppose Romeo and Juliet, perfect example. I mean, the star-crossed lovers, what do? They kill one another, right? Each commits suicide. Romeo, you know, with poison, of course, because he's distraught that he thinks Juliet's already dead. And then when Juliet wakes up and sees that he took poison, right, stabs herself. And you think, my goodness, these are two young people that haven't even gotten to the prime of their life yet, and they're so depressed about the way they view the world that they literally famously commit suicide. And you think, boy, that was pretty dumb. And yet people do it. Think, what? Now, it seems pretty easy to say that there's lots of reasons why people will commit suicide that are probably pretty straightforward. Especially if they're mentally ill. I've known people whose children literally were mentally ill and decided that was it, and they just jumped off the Cook Hotel. The spot, actually, where it's like, you know, that's where they land. Unfortunately, it's where the cooks usually hang out and smoke, so they shouldn't there, you know, because that's like the one spot where people could jump off the roof.
I almost landed on a truck too.
Landed on a truck?
Almost did. It was right there. They had people unloading luggage right there.
Oh, geez. There should be like a little X.
You
Warning,
can still see the spot.
Yeah. And then I had one student who decided to end his life by jumping off the Ship Creek Bridge. And he told me it wasn't high enough because he survived the jump. And in fact, you know, his life was way worse afterwards, because now he's like all busted up and in a wheelchair. And now he can't jump off of a bridge because he's, you know, he would need help. But you think, why are so many people killing themselves? What makes them do it? They didn't have their Wheaties that morning? Are we allowed to joke about this?
Well, I mean, nothing is sacred, so.
Wheaties are not sacred? Oh, sorry.
I think it's more of a cultural shift now, because I don't think back, I mean, they still happen, but I think back in the day it wasn't nearly as common as it is
Back
today.
then?
I don't know, some 200 years ago, maybe even. It still happened, but I don't think it was quite as popular as it seems to be today.
Well,
I think it's
the life expectancy of people, like, say in London 200 years ago, was like 20 something.
Yeah, so they didn't really get a chance either, though.
Yeah, they never even had a chance to get old enough to think about committing suicide, because they died from TB or Poe, Edgar Allan Poe's wife. He was in his early 20s, and she was 13 when he married her. 13 years old.
I think she was a cousin, right?
She was. And she died in her 20s. So it was it seems like the unusual person that lives pretty long. Yes. Ben Franklin, while he was staying in London the one time, in an embassy was actually a few rented rooms from a doctor who experimented on corpses. So like he basically paid grave robbers to bring in corpses and stuff, and he would cut them up, you know, and look at how the different things worked. And he ended up cutting himself and getting an infection. Of course, they had no cure for any of that, so he ended up dying. He knew what it was from, and he wasn't the only one that had that problem. That others, you know, who were studying corpses ended up by, you know, accidentally cutting yourself. You get an infection and die, you know, from the things and the putrefaction of these bodies that were, you know, it's illegal, but I mean, that was the way they got their bodies, was paying somebody. Sometimes they were fresh off of the, you know, the hangman's noose, you know, so you buy hung criminals and stuff. In fact, this painting is one of my favorites, Rembrandt, The Anatomy Lesson. So this is the anatomy lesson of Dr. Tulip, which is, yes, Dr. Tulip was the guy who invented tulips, so that's pretty cool too. That's an easy way to remember this.
He invented tulips, the flowers.
The flowers, tulips.
Oh.
Now, the Netherlands are famous for tulips, and he's like the guy that
Crossbred flower making.
I didn't really. There's a book that I read. I think it was called The Anatomy Lesson of Dr. Tulip, whatever. But it was a book about kind of all the background around this particular painting. So it was about Rembrandt, you know, and how he didn't actually paint this on the spot at the anatomy lesson. He had each of those individuals come to his studio, and he painted them individually in the place in the painting.
Corpse included?
Pardon?
Corpse included?
No, the corpse was a real historical person that had been hung that day, and they know enough about him that they know that Rembrandt had to fake the arm because he was a criminal who had had his arm chopped off for stealing stuff earlier in his life, and of course that didn't make his life any better, and so he kept stealing and stuff, and eventually was hung for all of his crimes. And Dr. Tulip paid the hangman for the body, so once the body was hung till it was dead, and the crowd kind of, oh, okay, and they all left, you know, the hangman takes it down and brings it over to Dr. Tulip's office, delivers it. And by the way, the anatomy lesson was not just for the people around the body, there was like a hall. So there was like a room where other people could pay to sit and watch and listen. And you could have lunch while you were there. So that was like a lunch theater, you know, kind of, you know, or, you know, dinner theater kind of experience. And one of the people at this particular anatomy lesson was René Descartes. So that's kind of cool. Ties Descartes into you know, this particular time and place in, I guess it was Amsterdam. So that's pretty interesting. So they're buying bodies. They get them one way or another. It's obviously not illegal, at least in Amsterdam. But Ben Franklin's, the doctor in Ben Franklin's London, when he was there, this was just on TV. There was like a TV show about Ben Franklin's bones. Was he the one that put these bones there? No, it wasn't him. It was the doctor that owned the house that he was renting rooms from, who was basically doing all these experiments for like an anatomy school, and then throwing the bones in a ditch when he was done with them out in the backyard, that reason I think this up is because, gosh, you know, that all these people that you read about, like Poe and his wife, and everybody died so early. Maybe the reason that they weren't killing themselves is because they didn't live long enough to even have that kind of a chance.
Or maybe they just figured it happened sooner or later, probably sooner than later.
Probably sooner than later, yeah. It's amazing that a lot of the famous philosophers lived pretty long, and you wonder how the heck they were unique in that they did that, you know, that they lived so long for their time. Hobbes, for example, 92, I think, you know, at a time where, you know, you could get your head chopped off just by looking funny, that kind of thing. So, I don't know if it's but obviously people have taken their lives when circumstances were miserable, you know, in lots of historical periods. But, so, last class we talked about briefly David Foster Wallace, and you know, we listened to some of his interview on Fresh Air, right, with you know, PB, you know, the national NPR, right, National Public Radio, right, we listened. And I think I mentioned, yes, that he committed suicide, so spelled David. In fact, have you listened to his, so he was 46 years old when he killed himself. Now, he did have depression, so he was at one time being medicated for depression. And he decided to go off the medicine and stop taking it, and then the depression came back. And so he decided, okay, I was better on the medicine, so he went back onto the medicine, and the medicine didn't work. And so the depression stayed, and it was shortly after that that his wife found him hanging from in the garage. So it's kind of recently we had Robin Williams, who was absolutely hilarious and ended up killing himself by hanging himself with his belt. Right? Probably all familiar with that. And you wonder, geez, you know, why on earth would someone with everything, that was so hilarious, life full of so many successes and everything, why on earth would he do that? So, and if I think, you know, from a philosophical perspective, it seems to me that somebody like Wallace was the one that you would least expect to do something like that. So,
if anybody feels like perspiring, I'd invite you to go ahead, because I'm sure going to. In fact, I'm going to get. Greetings, thanks, and congratulations to Kenyon's graduating class of 2005.
So
there are these two young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?"
Lecture. Right, so the college.
And the two young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over at the other and goes, "What the hell is water?" This is a standard requirement of U.S. commencement speeches, the deployment of didactic little parable-ish stories. The story thing turns out to be one of the better, less bullshitty conventions of the genre. But if you're worried that I plan to present myself here as the wise older fish explaining what water is to you younger fish, please don't be. I am not the wise old fish. The point of the fish story is merely that the most obvious, important realities are often the ones that are hardest to see and talk about. Stated as an English sentence, of course, this is just a banal platitude. But the fact is that in the day-to-day trenches of adult existence, banal platitudes can have a life or death importance. Or so I wish to suggest to you on this dry and lovely morning. Of course, the main requirement of speeches like this is that I'm supposed to talk about your liberal arts education's meaning, to try to explain why the degree you're about to receive has actual human value instead of just a material payoff. So let's talk about the single most pervasive cliche in the commencement speech genre, which is that a liberal arts education is not so much about filling you up with knowledge as it is about, quote, teaching you how to think. If you're like me as a student, you've never liked hearing this, and you tend to feel a bit insulted by the claim that you've needed anybody to teach you how to think, since the fact that you even got admitted to a college this good seems like proof that you already know how to think. But I'm going to posit to you that the liberal arts cliche turns out not to be insulting at all, because the really significant education in thinking that we're supposed to get in a place like this isn't really about the capacity to think, but rather about the choice of what to think about. If your total freedom of choice regarding what to think about seems too obvious to waste time discussing, I'd ask you to think about fish and water and to bracket for just a few minutes your skepticism about the value of the totally obvious. Here's another didactic little story. There are these two guys sitting together in a bar in the remote Alaskan wilderness. One of the guys is religious, the other's an atheist, and the two are arguing about the existence of God with that special intensity that comes after about the fourth beer. And the atheist says, look, it's not like I don't have actual reasons for not believing in God. It's not like I haven't ever experimented with the whole God and prayer thing. Just last month, I got caught away from camp in that terrible blizzard, and I was totally lost, and I couldn't see a thing, and it was 50 below. And so I tried it. I fell to my knees in the snow and cried out, oh God, if there is a God, I'm lost in this blizzard and I'm going to die if you don't help me. And now, in the bar, the religious guy looks at the atheist all puzzled. Well, then you must believe now, he says. After all, here you are, alive. The atheist just rolls his eyes. No, man, all that was a couple Eskimos happened to come wandering by and they showed me the way back to camp. It's easy to run this story through a kind of standard liberal arts analysis. The exact same experience can mean two totally different things to two different people, given those people's two different belief templates and two different ways of constructing meaning from experience. Because we prize tolerance and diversity of belief, nowhere in our liberal arts analysis do we want to claim that one guy's interpretation is true and the other guy's is false or bad. Which is fine, except we also never end up talking about just where these individual templates and beliefs come from, meaning where they come from inside the two guys. As if a person's most basic orientation toward the world and the meaning of his experience were somehow just hardwired, like height or shoe size, or automatically absorbed from the culture, like language. As if how we construct meaning were not actually a matter of personal, intentional choice.
Remember, this is the guy that's going to commit suicide himself.
Plus there's the matter of arrogance. The non-religious guy is so totally certain in his dismissal of the possibility that the passing Eskimos had anything to do with his prayer for help. True, there are plenty of religious people who seem arrogantly certain of their own interpretations too. They're probably even more repulsive than atheists, at least to most of us. But religious dogmatist problem is exactly the same as the story's unbeliever: blind certainty. A closed-mindedness that amounts to an imprisonment so total that the prisoner doesn't even know he's locked up. The point here is that I think this is one part of what teaching me how to think is really supposed to mean: to be just a little less arrogant, to have just a little critical awareness about myself and my certainties, because a huge percentage of stuff that I tend to be automatically certain of is, it turns out, totally wrong and deluded. I have learned this the hard way, as I predict you graduates will too. Here is just one example of the total wrongness of something I tend to be automatically sure of. Everything in my own immediate experience supports my deep belief that I am the absolute center of the universe, the realest, most vivid and important person in existence. We rarely talk about this sort of natural basic self-centeredness because it's so socially repulsive, but it's pretty much the same for all of us. It is our default setting, hardwired into our boards at birth. Think about it. There is no experience you have had that you are not at the absolute center of. The world as you experience it is there in front of you or behind you, to the left or right of you, on your TV or your monitor, and so on. Other people's thoughts and feelings have to be communicated to you somehow, but your own are so immediate, urgent, real. Please don't worry that I'm getting ready to lecture you about compassion or other directedness or all the so-called virtues. This is not a matter of virtue. It's a matter of my choosing to do the work of somehow altering or getting free of my natural hardwired default setting, which is to be deeply and literally self-centered, and to see and interpret everything through this lens of self. People who can adjust their natural default setting this way are often described as being well adjusted, which I suggest to you is not an accidental term. Given the triumphant academic setting here, an obvious question is how much of this work of adjusting our default setting involves actual knowledge or intellect. This question gets very tricky. Probably the most dangerous thing about an academic education, at least in my own case, is that it enables my tendency to over-intellectualize stuff, to get lost in abstract arguments inside my head, instead of simply paying attention to what's going on right in front of me. Paying attention to what is going on inside me. As I'm sure you guys know by now, it is extremely difficult to stay alert and attentive instead of getting hypnotized by the constant monologue inside your own head. Maybe happening right now. 20 years after my own graduation, I have come gradually to understand that the liberal arts cliche about teaching you how to think is actually shorthand for a much deeper, more serious idea. Learning how to think really means learning how to exercise some control over how and what you think. It means being conscious and aware enough to choose what you pay attention to and to choose how you construct meaning from experience. Because if you cannot exercise this kind of choice in adult life, you will be totally hosed. Think of the old cliche about, quote, the mind being an excellent servant but a terrible master. This, like many cliches, so lame and unexciting on the surface, actually expresses a great and terrible truth.
I'm thinking that since all of his work focuses on the meaninglessness in life and how sad that makes us, even though we have everything. So you have all the wealth, you have all sorts of, remember he talks about having a nice car, a nice house, a nice spouse, a nice this, all those things. He's got all that stuff. By the way, he never had kids. That was one thing. But you got all this nice stuff, and yet you're like depressed because life seems boring. Basically, you feel sad because like there's like nothing that drives you. So that's, and it reminds me when Epicurus talks about happiness. And we've really, I think, come a long way in describing happiness, so that we know that you can't become happy by trying to be happy. The happiness comes kind of as a side effect of accomplishing something else. So like if you want to cure cancer, and you actually end up curing some forms of cancer, and you have patients that are all happy and so on, you'll have accomplished a great thing, and you'll feel happy because of the accomplishment, right? But it's not like you set out to be happy. You set out to cure cancer, right? And happiness is a side effect. So if you're like trying to be happy, you're going to fail miserably, because it's like it's like the photographer that wants to take a picture of the horizon and keeps heading out that way, trying to get closer to the horizon. It's a dumb joke, right? You're not going to find happiness by looking for happiness, right? So if you're an Epicurean and what you want to do is just be happy, it sounds like you're just doomed to failure. As you can see in Trimalchio's feast, that's obviously one of the saddest parties I've ever seen. Right? I mean, nobody's happy. Everybody's forced to act like they're happy. Hail to you, what a wonderful beard, your first beard. Oh, I'm thrilled for you, etc. Right? But actually, no one looks like they're happy. They look like they're bored to death. Does that make sense? Well, so let's think about Descartes' article a little bit. Was this interesting so far?
In a morbid kind of way.
Pardon?
In a morbid kind of way.
Well, that's interesting because I'm trying to fight the morbidity.
It's just a topic that doesn't escape it.
Well, it's like, gosh, if we're looking for the meaning of life, looking for the meaning of life turns out to be the same kind of thing as happiness, where if you're looking for meaning, it's not like something you're going to find. Meaning is like happiness. It's like a side effect of accomplishing, and accomplishing something, that's what gives you meaning in life, right? So to find meaning in life, what you have to do is have goals besides finding meaning in life. But here's the problem with his life and with studying philosophy, looking for the meaning of life. You're so wrapped up in searching for the meaning of life in the same way that a hedonist is looking for happiness. You're not going to find it. And in a way, I suspect that he ended up failing miserably, finding meaning in his own life, ended up committing suicide because of it. He spends all this time writing books, like The Infinite Jest, which I don't know if you've seen it. I have a copy at home. It's a humongous tome. That's what I was reading. So it's huge, right? And so infinite in the sense that it feels like it's an infinitely long book, going no place, by the way, and a jest because he's making fun of the fact that the book itself is a joke. Right? So this is actually an infinite jest. Remember, he even has a movie being made in the book as part of the story called Infinite Jest, right? So it's a joke. And what's the main joke? The joke is that life isn't meaningful. So the whole purpose of being a student in philosophy and studying in order to find the meaning of life turns out to give you the answer that there is no meaning in life, right? So it's an infinite jest. It's just a joke. So it's incredibly depressing. And if that's what you do in life, is write incredibly depressing books searching for the meaning of life, it seems most obvious that what's depressed him to death has been his own search, misguided in a sense, for the meaning of life. Whereas if I think about Miroslav Volf or David Brooks, who we saw discussing the nature of character or flourishing, human flourishing, right? Those two guys are thrilled with life, invigorated, and they're just so motivated. It's amazing. They're like heroes of our culture, and they're looking for the same thing, but they're doing it in a completely different way. They're looking for meaning in life through religious narration on the part of Miroslav Volf's part, and through exemplars of all sorts of lives on the part of David Brooks, right? So if you think, what's different between those two individuals and their success in their quest and David Foster Wallace? I mean, he's still kind of a hero because he's got it. He understands the whole nature of the quest, which is what's so alarming, because here he is, he understands it, and yet at the same time, it kills him. He doesn't get it well enough that he's able to protect himself to a nice long life, right? And yet he had all the trappings of it. Same kind of thing as Robin Williams. He's got all the wealth. He's got all the things that you would feel like you need in order to have a happy life. He has, right? And at the same time, he's depressed while having it. That's incredibly frustrating. Why such a role model who we listen to this lecture that he gives at that college, what is water, right? That's like famous. You buy it as a book form. Why would you buy it? You could just listen to him give it. They don't have the video, right? Instead you have this like odd podcast here of him doing this.
Everybody feels like perspiring.
Although there was an interesting, I think this might be it. This is.
There are these two young fish swimming along.
So this is actually a better variant on, it's still just his narrating that they recorded, but whoever put this one together fills it up with like, here's two fish, he's got, so all, standing in the grocery line, how boring could that be, etc., right? So.
Open, even though it's the end of the day rush. So the checkout line is incredibly long, which is stupid and infuriating, but you can't take your frustration out on the frantic lady working the register.
So, that's all part. So this is a better variant on the, instead of just him, a picture, but still, this is like a famous lecture because he's basically saying, okay, so this is the whole point of life, basically. And then, of course, look at what it does to the person who, of all the academics, seems to get it. That's kind of depressing. There's got to be something wrong. So we go back to the question I posed. Regarding religion, what's the value of religion? You think, well, there's different competing meta-narratives that we associate with the traditional religions, or even non-traditional religions. You could, as we talked, science could certainly be a meta-narrative for somebody. It certainly is for Richard Dawkins, although you might disagree with Richard Dawkins, right?
I think a lot of scientists won't say it's their religion, but I think it almost is, especially within the academic school system. It's almost treated as a religion the way it's taught. It's taught to be, even though it's constantly changing, not to be questioned in a way. So it's definitely interesting.
Well, and remember Crane's book, The Meaning of Religion? That, by the way, it's in the library. I put in my request for it, so I'll get to read it soon. The one I read the review from the New York Times the last time. And remember his description of religion like fit mine to a T. I was like, yes, I'm not the weirdo. There's other people out there that think that science is clearly a state religion. Actually, we have a state religion. It meets all the sociological criteria of religious narration and institutions and so on. So that you have to believe it, etc. Right?
The only problem with it doesn't really it doesn't give a good moral basis for actions. Its ethics can change very easily. The only reason, ethics and science are just based on the cultural perception. Whereas when you have a religion with a God like Christianity, it gives you a moral foundation that's easier to argue than science's version, if you're going purely science versus purely religion.
Well, I think what science has to do is say that morality is based on our biology and our sociological status, and so
it's just much harder to argue.
So things can change it. If you're living on an island and, you know, 2 or 3 hurricanes in a row come by and just knock the heck out of your infrastructure, the nature of morality on that island is going to change. I mean, you're going to be desperate, you know, the kinds of things. You're not going to be wondering about the arts, you know, because all the paintings you've just blown away, right? So there's no art that you want to protect and stuff. Now, basic life is the real issue. They still don't have water or electricity and you know, that kind of, so yeah, the environment's going to have an impact and will change your morality. So if you're fighting, for example, over one of the 8 concerns that I posted regarding a person, say, should we have an abortion or not, right? You know, that's, you know, that whole issue changes drastically depending on the circumstances surrounding it. So utilitarianism seems to be the scientific moral point of view. And utility takes into account the actual environmental circumstances. So that's why it's not a rule, thou shalt not ever do this. Well, utility will say, unless under these conditions. Morality will change it. So utilitarianism. Sam Harris too, if you're thinking of, we talked about Sam Harris at least once, right? Sam Harris. He's the one that gives the lecture.
Facts and values seem to belong to different spheres. It's often thought that there's no description of the way the world is.
Right, so just blow by blow, explain. So we have the fact-value distinction. Thanks to David Hume, we have this basic argument that says that you cannot go from a fact to an ought statement. So I can't say this book has all sorts of traditional classic arguments as well as contemporary arguments on philosophical issues. Reading philosophy helps you understand the nature of the human predicament. Therefore, you ought to read this book. All right? That's an illegitimate argument, according to David Hume, because I went from 2 factual statements to an ought statement. And you can't go from an is statement, a fact statement, to an ought statement, because where did the ought come from? So it's an invalid argument. There's something in my conclusion that's not there in my premises. And the ought statements in general are not scientific statements. They're not observations of a situation of a fact. They're an interpretation of a fact, right?
But can it still be argued logically, which is used in science, but it's not of science, so technically it'd still work, right?
Well, in order to incorporate the ought into the argument so that it's a valid argument, you have to have an ought statement in the premises. But then you have the problem of that not being a fact, so you can't say that that premise is true or false, because you have an ought statement in the premise. So the problem just keeps moving. You know, you can move it further back and move it further back, but the problem is still there. That a fact is, these are glasses. These are good glasses, not a scientific fact. Right? Now it's an interpretation. And it turns out that all of our values are interpretations. So you can't base those on science. so you get facts, this is science, and values, that's religion, right? So the first thing, you know, can science answer moral questions? The Academy says no, because that's not its area of interest. Science describes what is, not what ought to be, right? But he's upset with that, and so is basically going to try to argue against it.
Is that can tell us how the world ought to be. But I think this is quite clearly untrue. But values are a certain kind of fact.
So basically he's going to take sides. And that's what he does. He takes sides and says that values are a certain kind of fact, and then he tells you which kind.
They are facts about the well-being of conscious creatures. Why is it that we don't have ethical obligations toward rocks? Why don't we feel compassion for rocks?
Have you seen this one before?
It's because we don't think rocks can suffer. And if we're more concerned about
Morgan,
our fellow
you've seen
primates
everything, right?
than we are about insects, as indeed we are, it's because we think they're exposed to a greater range of potential happiness and suffering. Now, the crucial thing to notice here is that this is a factual claim. This is something we could be right or wrong about. I mean, if we misconstrued the relationship between biological complexity and the possibilities of experience, well, then we could be wrong about the inner lives of insects. Okay, there is no notion, no version of human morality and human values that I've ever come across that is not at some point reducible to a concern about conscious experience and its possible changes. I mean, even if you get your values from religion, even if you think that good and evil ultimately relate to conditions after death, either to an eternity of happiness with God or an eternity of suffering in hell, you are still concerned about consciousness and its changes. And to say that such changes can persist after death is itself a factual claim, which, of course, may or may not be true. Now, to speak about the conditions of well-being in this life for human beings, we know that there's a continuum of such facts.
This is bad.
We know that it's possible to live in a failed state, where everything that can go wrong does go wrong, where mothers cannot feed their children, where strangers cannot find the basis for peaceful.
So he's going to basically argue that, you know, we can look inside the brain today and see whether you're happy or not, and say, aha, so the things that led to this happy brain state are good, the things that led to this unhappy brain state are bad, so these things should be the things that society does. So,
well, that changes pretty easy though. Like, you can have one person who, because they gather a lot of wealth, is happy, and another person who gathers a lot of wealth is unhappy. It's the same thing that leads to both outcomes. So is it good or bad?
Well, he talks about, how come I can't see, it won't give me the moral peaks.
Wouldn't want to belong to any string theory club that would have me as a member. To needless human suffering.
Somewhere in
combustible
women. Okay, so we appear to have a genuine difference of opinion of what to do about them.
No,
now around 80 in the developed world.
Okay.
There may come a time when we meddle with our genomes and
this particular
good behavior.
TED Talk is pushing his book,
Is there
The Moral
any
Landscape.
doubt
That's why it is.
that this question has an answer in about Connecticut?
So this is the moral landscape in the back. I'm trying to find the picture.
The map of the space. That we will have scientific answers to every conceivable moral that we rarely access. That of possible changes. Effects of a maturing science of the mind, neuroscience,
I'll
psychology,
leave this so
etc.
you can
So
find
what I'm
this.
arguing
This is just
that
Sam Harris TED
values
Talk.
reduced to facts about the conscious
As far as I know,
experience
the
of conscious.
that he does. It's a TED Talk. Yeah, so he's going to try to say that science can answer those questions. I agree with you basically though that science doesn't really have that capability.
Well, it's not made to do that. The whole process of how we identify science doesn't work that way. Because it's an abstract.
There are moral requirements for science. So, for example, a good scientist. You know, so we have the conception of a good scientist, which automatically is a value statement. So strictly speaking, the difference between a good scientist and a bad scientist isn't scientific. It's moral, right? And what do we mean by that? Well, a good scientist is someone who doesn't lie about their experiments, that is particular about making sure that their experiments are efficient, reflective of what's actually the case, and not just kind of promoting a particular agenda that they might have, that this pill will be good for you. I'm not really checking to make sure that it's got no bad effects or anything, right? Because they're paying me to show that this pill is successful, right? Well, that kind of mercurial push behind a product is not a good scientific value, right? But it's a bad thing. So there's all sorts of things that a good scientist is supposed to have, and those are characteristics that are strictly speaking not scientific, but instead moral, and moral issues are associated with religious narrative. How did we get onto that? I forget. But well, let me move to this last part of today's discussion piece, and that's
of how things seem to be in a perceptual experience.
So I picked this particular
organizer of many events, editor of TV publication series, and increasingly
thinking Descartes gives us the, I think therefore I am, and the I think part is my internal reflection. The same kind of thing that David Foster Wallace is worried about, what's going on in my brain, etc. And Chalmers brings in the virtual reality technology as a new exciting dilemma for all of this, because it's kind of an experiment, the same as the movie.
Thanks, David, and thanks to all of you for coming. It's a special pleasure to be speaking here. I actually, well, I ordered myself a virtual reality device, an Oculus Rift, off the web, and I've been playing around with it. And then I find that I have to actually, give some talks and write about it in order to justify charging it to my research account.
The university has not chipped in on my Oculus Rift. I bought it myself.
Of that project, but virtual reality really raises a lot of
ago I bought that.
Philosophical issues. Virtual reality technology
is cheaper now,
roughly speaking, technology that produces experiences as of an external reality, but typically grounded in a computer simulation of an external
the main expense is you have
reality.
To
So typical virtual reality technology works with a some kind of a headset. So this is the Oculus Rift virtual reality headset that's recently attracted a whole lot of attention. I think the company Oculus was just founded about 3 years ago. This is Palmer Luckey, the CEO of Oculus. And now just not much more than a year ago, they were bought out by Facebook,
I think at Best
for
Buy,
$2 billion.
You have like 4 or 5
I guess these virtual reality technology as, among other things, the future of social networking. So in the future, we're all going to be hanging out on Facebook in a virtual world.
I think like 15 bucks.
Just bidding phones pretty right.
This the Oculus Rift is still hasn't been released to consumers, but it's
basically
online for that sometime.
That enable you to
early next year. I mean, virtual reality technology has been around for a very long time. Psychologists, neuroscientists, and others have been using it in their work for a long time. Here's a visit I recently made to. I recently visited a virtual reality lab in Tübingen, run by a bunch of psychologists and computer scientists. This is a lab of Betty Moeller here, and here's me all dressed up in a virtual reality bodysuit. 17
like,
sensors.
You were talking about
all
how
over,
we don't have touch,
all over
sense of touch.
over the suit. So my other
they
things
are
they
working
got
on it.
transform my body. I could be wandering around in virtual reality. I think at this point,
this isn't even really virtual
inside a
reality.
female body, and I'm
Because
looking
virtual
down at my
reality is
pointy little
experience
feet.
basically through our body, right?
Inside
It's our-
the VR. So,
I
so a
guess
lot
you'd
of
say
very
our
cool
brain's
stuff has been happening
experience, our
with
inner self's experience
virtual
of the world.
reality
Right.
lately. It's also becoming
However,
more and more
if
widespread
that's
and
virtual
available
reality, why are you still
to
experiencing it through this
consumers.
reality's body?
I'm really interested
If it
here
was
in
real virtual reality.
the issues that
it
virtual
somehow
reality raises
plug into your brain
for
directly, so that you didn't
philosophy.
feel as if
I mean,
you
one of the cool things
are
about
in your body.
virtual reality is
and,
that
and
you can
another
use it to
thing,
pose
it'd be
a
directly
very
in
large
you.
number of the
So
classic
it's like,
issues in
I
philosophy,
think the term for it is
topics
full
that
dive,
arise for
where
all
your
the
brain
central
is
areas
plugged into
of philosophy
like where
through the
it's
lens
hypothetical
of virtual
matrix.
reality.
like, yeah,
So
where your body
perhaps
doesn't
most
actually
obviously
move,
there are
but in this other reality,
epistemological issues,
when your
issues
brain
about
sends an
knowledge
impulse like
where
you're
we
right
can
on
kind of
the move, your
reframe
real body isn't moving,
the old
but
issue
in the
of
world,
skepticism about the
virtually,
external
it is.
world.
One
Descartes
guy asked
asked,
a question.
how do we know
later,
that we're not
after
being
the
fooled by
question
an
and
evil
answer period
genius
starts.
into thinking there's a
What
world out
about
there when in
dreams?
fact
You
evil
know, our
genius is
dreams
just
kind
feeding
of
us
like virtual
these
reality.
sensations of the world.
Kind of argue
You know,
that don't make
that
sense,
gets
but
reframed as the issue.
in
How
the
do we know we're
concept
not
of
in a
going
virtual
for it,
reality?
it would apply.
Like
It just
the
be a
Matrix.
really weird reality.
Which many people take to be a way of
This is a
posing
different one.
that problem of how do we know that our experience is not completely
So should I
illusory
bring
and
the Oculus
deceptive.
Rift in? Would people be
There
interested
are
in
issues
trying it
in
for a little bit?
metaphysics. What is the nature of the object
I can
you interact with?
I can take the
in a
show on the
virtual
road
world,
because I
interact
have
with something like
a
a virtual
laptop.
table or a virtual tennis
That
racket
it plugs
and
into.
so on. What is the ontological status of those objects
The trouble
ultimately
is I
grounded
need
in
like
some
a
kind of
grocery cart to carry that
computation?
laptop
You might
around.
suggest a whole new kind of ontology of the objects
like-
we
like-
interact with as being computational or
Heavier
informational.
than some.
There are issues about
desktop
language,
solution.
how to analyze meaning in virtual reality, especially as people go back and forth between normal external
So
reality,
this is
non-virtual
like a
reality,
personal
and virtual
explorer on-
reality. We often use a lot of the same words, table, chair, and so on. Do they mean something different things, inside and outside?
I'll plan on
virtual
bringing it in, I
reality?
guess, next class.
There are issues about value. So Robert Nozick
Yeah.
famously posed issues about what we value using, basically using a virtual reality metaphor. He used the example of the experience machine. Just say we had a chance to enter an experience.
See if I can get it.
Multi-component reality.
So here's his conclusion. In everyday interactions with virtual reality, things are as they seem to be, much as in ordinary reality. And this is one plank in making a general case. Virtual reality is not second-class reality. So when you start using virtual reality, and by the way, this presentation will talk about how this is going to become more and more of a part of our everyday lives, especially in
the first world countries.
Right.
And millennials definitely.
Well, it could influence some individuals in third world countries. It would be way cheaper, actually, for people in third world countries to move into the modern world by having a virtual reality set up in the environment than other way. It's way cheaper, way cheaper. But the thing is, when you put it on, you know you're wearing goggles. You know you're in a virtual reality thing. You know, so like, you know you're in your living room and you take them off, to get a drink, and you put it, and keep in mind that that glass of water is there, so that when you're moving around, you don't go boonk, right? Right? So you know that you're in that environment. So it's not really fooling us into thinking that we're really in Paris, right? I know I'm in my basement, my den, whatever you want to call it, room, looking at this, right? And so when I bring it in and I have it sitting in I'll bring it into the classroom. Hopefully it will work. I have to make sure. I've never brought it into the building and set it up and made sure that it works. But it should, because it has to be on the internet. You can't obviously just use it standalone. It has to be connected to the web. But I'll try bringing it in. But so if like all of a sudden you find yourself floating out in space, don't worry that you're going to fall because you're actually standing on the floor, right? Does that make sense?
But like, there's an argument that another detail of virtual reality isn't true you can feel your body still standing. You can feel the pressure on the bottoms of your feet, right? So you would know, even if you're floating in space, you can feel pressure
You know
on
what's
you
weird
standing.
is if
So
you're
that's
suddenly finding yourself, like, a helicopter flying over the islands, Barbados or whatever that island, so you're, and why do they do this? They stick the camera out over the, instead of sitting in the helicopter so you feel like, oh, I've got some security, they just stick it out so the video starts and you're like, whoa, nothing under you.
Which would give me some weird vertigo.
It doesn't feel like you've got pressure under your feet. You do, obviously, or you would be falling. But your mind tells you I'm out over nothing, right? That's kind of annoying. So what's a good question? What would you like to see if I brought in the Oculus Rift? What experience would you like to see? Because it depends on what you download. So I have Google Earth, so that you can see any place on the Earth that's been videoed by satellites, basically. I have Tilt Brush, which is a painting program that's completely, so like if you're in Van Gogh's Starry Night, right? You're actually standing in, so everything's all around you and everything's all moving. So that's Tilt Brush. You could actually be in. Is it virtual reality art? I don't know what you would call that. 360, but it's more than 360.
So
I don't know what the heck to call it. Tilt Brush. It's this is so I have this on there too. What else? Oh, I have Facebook Spaces, but Facebook Spaces is like Facebook. That's very disorienting. I don't do that very often because it's you're weightless moving around, and it really makes it feel like you are, although of course you're not. So, that's pretty weird.
It's kind of interesting because you know how if you're in a dream you're falling, you'll feel like you're falling even though you're still stuck.
Tilt Brush is a virtual reality application.
Mind over body, right? Kind of interesting.
Oh.
Because in a dream, if you fall, like if you dream you're a nightmare, I guess, you're falling through the sky, you'll wake up like you were falling, but you weren't. You were totally safe and sound, but you can totally feel it because it tricks you. And I think there was I read it, I can't remember where, it was talking about a theory of where the mind makes no difference between what you imagine and what you remember as a memory.
Right.
So you can remember, oh, I drove to class today, but you can also imagine driving to a classroom the same way, and there'd be no difference in your mind between what was a fake imagination thing and a real memory, because both happen in your mind, right? So it's interesting.
Are any of you coming by my house for candy tonight? Because I'm not planning on turning the lights on. Because our house is a mess. There's like tires just sitting in the path. We still haven't given the tires back that we didn't want. Whatever. So no. The answer is no. You're not stopping by and scared me. And so the quiz question, everybody got? Yes? What would you like to see on? But you can take like a roller coaster. You know, they do that. Roller coasters or car races or whatever. They put the camera on and then you drive, and you're going to puke. You know, if you're susceptible to motion sickness on those things, you're sitting in a chair in your living room and you're going to puke because your eyes will fool you completely. Unless you're like, oh, that's enough. And you don't have to worry if you're like, you can like take it off and say, okay, I'm done. You don't have to worry about like, oh, am I going to crash now? Because it is, you know it's virtual reality. It's not the real thing. I bet they could do. I bet they could like torture people. You know, that they capture and what.
Actually, I was just thinking about that. The reason torture is partly so effective is not necessarily what they do to the human body to cause pain. It's what the person who's going to be tortured thinks is going to happen. Because again, the imagination is the same as a memory. So if you just got like, I don't know, your fingernails pulled off, you have that memory of intense pain, right? But then you can also imagine what's going to be worse, and then that's the same as a memory. So your body just tripled itself.
Well, there's like Disney's making stuff for this too, of course, right? And so one of the videos is from the Jungle Book, and it's the snake, you know, talking, trust in me. I guess it's a song or something.
Yeah.
And you know, so the snake is coming. It says, "You can relax. I won't hurt you." Of course, it ends with the mouth, you know, about ready to gobble you up. You know, so
That's gonna be a fun
that could be scary. That could be scary if you're a kid.
Disney, no longer for children. That would be.
Was it ever?
I don't know.
Was it ever for children? I don't know. Question. It copied.